The sound of rain was an angry drumbeat on the asphalt. Sirens wailed in the distance, a mournful sound that cut through the thick, desperate night air. My mop, usually my silent companion through the graveyard shift, clattered to the ground, the plastic bucket tumbling with a dull, echoing thud. A man was there, dragging himself across the slick, oil-stained parking lot toward the service entrance. He was nothing but a shadow, a whisper of expensive, ruined clothes and blood. He stopped at my feet, his face a mask of pain and desperation. His eyes, even in the poor light, were fierce and aristocratic, but they held a plea so raw it froze my breath. His voice, a low rasp of sheer panic, trembled as he forced the words out. "Please, help me. I can't walk." I stood paralyzed. I was just Arya D'Souza, the night janitor, invisible and ordinary. I had no idea then, looking down at the man begging at my feet, that he was Dante Bellini, the undisputed, terrifying, unseen ruler of the city's shadows. If you believe no one is beyond redemption, if you believe that a single act of kindness can change the course of two broken lives, hit subscribe and like this video. Only the coldest hearts would ignore a cry for help. Join me as I tell you how I saved the man who held the whole city in his hand. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, disorganized beat. Instinct, that reckless, stupid thing, took over. I couldn't leave him. He wasn't just injured, he was dying. I knelt beside him, the smell of rain, car exhaust, and copper-laced blood filling my nostrils. I remember the immediate, shocking collision of our worlds. My worn-out sneakers were inches from his custom-made Italian leather shoes, now scuffed and ruined. His coat, dark and heavy, felt like pure silk under my cheap work gloves. He was the picture of power brought low, an emperor crawling through the mud of his own collapse. His empire, I would later learn, had not just crumbled, it had actively turned on him. I knew I couldn't call the police. Anyone begging for help in this state, bleeding this much, didn't want the police. They wanted to vanish. And in that moment, I was his best option for vanishing. My workplace, a sprawling, deserted downtown office building, was my only sanctuary, and it was about to become his hiding place. "I'm going to help you, but you need to be quiet," I instructed, my voice firm despite the tremble in my hands. The sight of his blood slicking the pavement sent a tremor of real fear through me, but I pushed it down. I was a janitor. I cleaned up messes. This was just the biggest, most dangerous mess I'd ever faced. Getting him inside was a Herculean task. He was heavy, a solid, broad wall of muscle, and his leg was clearly shattered. I looped his arm over my shoulder, the unexpected, intimate weight of him staggering me. His body was tense, rigid with pain, and perhaps something else. A lifetime of never needing to rely on anyone. As I half dragged, half carried him toward the back service elevator, he gritted his teeth, not a single sound of pain escaping his lips. That silence was more terrifying than any scream. It told me everything about his capacity for endurance and his capacity for control. Inside the rattling elevator, the air was suddenly charged. We were pressed together, a janitor and a king, two halves of a world that should never have touched. The harsh fluorescent light revealed the severity of his injuries. The dark fabric of his coat was saturated. I could see the sweat on his temples, the effort it took just to stand supported by my thin frame. His eyes met mine in the reflection of the stainless steel elevator wall. They were a startling, intense shade of brown, and in them I saw an emptiness, a profound weariness that had nothing to do with his wounds. They were haunted eyes, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and done worse. "Where are you taking me?" His voice was barely a whisper now. "Somewhere nobody goes," I whispered back, my own voice shaking slightly. "The boiler room. It's dusty, hot, and locked off." He didn't argue. He just studied me, his gaze analytical, cold, and assessing. It was the look of a predator trying to understand an anomaly. Why was this woman not running? Why was she risking her freedom, her life, for a dying stranger? When the elevator reached the basement, I led him down a narrow, shadowy corridor to the back of the building. We moved in a slow, agonizing rhythm. My small, practical hands were clutching the waist of a man who, just hours before, had probably been commanding armies. As I guided him, his breath was hot against my neck, a startling, intimate contact that made me blush despite the chaos. It was the first time a man had been this close to me in years, and the irony of it, that it was a man bleeding out from a gunshot wound, was not lost on me. Finally, we reached the heavy steel door of the old boiler room. It was always warm back here, the low thrum of the ancient machinery providing a constant, dull background noise that masked other sounds. Perfect. I fumbled with the old rusty lock I kept meaning to report, and finally the door groaned open on protesting hinges. I lowered him onto a pile of discarded, dust-sheeted equipment. As I did, the rain outside seemed to mix with his blood on the collar of my uniform. For a brief, terrifying moment, his weight completely overwhelmed me, and my head rested against his shoulder. I felt the powerful, erratic beat of his heart right next to my ear. When I pulled back, he watched me, his expression unreadable. I was safe. He was safe. The immediate danger was gone, but a new, terrifying kind of tension filled the small, dusty space. My hands, still trembling, came up to cup my own face. "You're safe now," I finally managed to whisper, not just to him, but to the rising panic inside my own chest. Safe. The word felt hollow and ironic, like a bad joke. I had just traded one kind of fear, the fear of a lonely, anonymous life, for another, the fear of harboring a fugitive, a dangerous man whose identity I couldn't even guess. I looked at him again. Dante Bellini. A name I didn't know yet, a face that was etched with cruelty and a strange, unexpected beauty. His world of luxury, violence, and unimaginable power had literally collapsed and landed at my feet, the janitor in the basement. Our worlds had collided, and in the blood and the dust, a new forbidden story had just begun. The camera, if there was one, would linger right there, on my small, trembling hands, contrasted with his large, powerful ones, now stained with his own undoing. The boiler room was our prison and our sanctuary. It was a suffocatingly hot, loud chamber, the smell of burnt oil and stale air mixing with the antiseptic I'd managed to find in the first aid kit. The intensity of the previous night had been replaced by a slow, agonizing tension. I had tried to make him comfortable. I found an old, worn-out mat I used for cleaning floors and folded it into a makeshift pillow. I cleaned his wounds, a brutal job that involved peeling away the expensive, blood-soaked fabric from his skin. He didn't flinch once, not even when I had to extract a small piece of shrapnel from his shoulder with my tweezers. His endurance was unsettling, superhuman. He watched me the entire time, his gaze intense and unnerving, studying my every move as if I were a puzzle he was trying to solve, or perhaps a threat he was measuring. He didn't thank me. The word thank you seemed to be absent from his vocabulary. Instead, he simply demanded things in a low, gravelly voice. A glass of water, a blanket, for me to check the wound again. He was used to commanding, not asking, and the arrogance, even lying wounded in a basement, was infuriating. "You need to stop ordering me around like I'm one of your men," I snapped one afternoon, placing a bowl of hot soup I'd smuggled from my break room table beside him. The defiance was purely defensive. His presence, his sheer intensity, was making me forget the rules of my own quiet, small life. He didn't respond to my outburst, but a flicker of surprise crossed his eyes, a brief acknowledgement that he had stepped over a boundary. He just picked up the bowl and ate, quickly, efficiently, like an animal or a soldier. For hours, he would just lie there, silent, awake, observing. I'd try to occupy myself, sweeping up the dust, organizing the forgotten junk, anything to avoid the magnetic pull of his gaze. I hummed sometimes, a mindless habit I'd picked up from my childhood. It was a quiet, melancholy melody, an old folk tune I hadn't thought about in years. After a long stretch of silence, his voice cut through the thrum of the machinery, low and sudden. "Where did you learn that song?" I froze, the dustpan falling from my hand. It was the first time he had asked me a question that wasn't a demand. It was personal.
"It's nothing," I mumbled, quickly bending to pick up the pan. "Tell me," he insisted, his tone suddenly softer, less a command and more a request that still held the weight of one. I sighed, turning to look at him. My brother used to sing it. It was his favorite. He called it the Song of the Restless Heart. A shadow crossed my face, and the small, protective smile I wore when I thought of my brother Marco faded completely. Marco, my only family, gone too soon. The memory was still a fresh, jagged wound. Dante didn't press for details, but he turned his head away, looking toward the dark corner of the boiler room. It wasn't the gesture of a man who was bored or dismissive. It was the gesture of a man who was suddenly, subtly uncomfortable. He had a look in his eyes, a dark, brief flicker of guilt, or perhaps just profound regret. It was too fast to name, but it was there, and it puzzled me. Why would a complete stranger, a dangerous man in hiding, look guilty when I mentioned my dead brother? I pushed the thought away, attributing it to my own grief-fueled imagination. Our days fell into a strange, unsettling routine. I would arrive at 11 p.m. for my shift, bring him food and clean supplies, check his wounds, and stay until 4 a.m. He would tell me nothing about himself, and I told him nothing but the necessary details of my life, that I was alone, that I lived a few blocks away, that I needed this job. One evening, I was cleaning an old wooden crate near his makeshift bed when a tiny detail snagged my attention. A faint, almost imperceptible scar, the shape of a crooked, ancient V, marked the side of his wrist, just where his cuff would have covered it. I watched as his fingers, long, elegant, yet clearly capable of great violence, flexed unconsciously. He caught my gaze on his wrist and quickly pulled his hand back, tucking it under the thin blanket. The reaction was too quick, too guarded. It was a reflex of a man used to keeping secrets hidden, even tiny, insignificant ones. "Don't stare," he said, the old hardness back in his voice. "I wasn't staring," I lied, turning away quickly. "Just noticing." Notice the walls, not me. But I couldn't stop. He was an enigma, a walking, breathing mystery I had accidentally unlocked. He was too refined to be a petty criminal, too wounded to be a simple executive. He had the air of someone who had commanded vast, unforgiving power. His silence spoke volumes. The truth, the terrifying, life-shattering truth, was buried right there in the dusty silence of the boiler room, between the janitor and the man she had saved. And my heart, against all logic, was beginning to gravitate toward the very thing that would eventually destroy me. That secret, the one that caused him to flinch when I mentioned Marco, was a ticking bomb. I knew it, deep down, but I was already too invested in the man's compelling, dangerous presence to back away. The magnetic pull had begun, and I was just an ordinary girl, caught in the fierce gravitational field of a falling star. The secret was there,
hovering like the dust motes in the warm basement light, waiting to explode. Dante had been in the basement for nearly a week. His physical pain was beginning to ease, but his pride, that invisible granite armor he wore, still burned fiercely. He was a creature of command, and being confined, reliant, and vulnerable was clearly torture for him. One morning, I brought him a coffee, scalding hot and strong, just the way he'd managed to convey he liked it without ever saying it directly. He tried to give an order. "Take this back. It's too hot to drink right now. Wait for my signal." The audacity of it, even after I'd risked everything for him, finally snapped my last thread of patience. I put the mug down, not gently, on the metal drum beside his bed. "Listen to me, Dante," I said, using his name for the first time, a name he had reluctantly, almost begrudgingly, given me when I needed to write a fake chart for his medication. I leaned in, meeting his fierce gaze with my own tired, resolute one. "I am not your soldier, and this isn't your empire. You are a guest here, a very wounded, very demanding guest. If you want the coffee, drink it when it cools. I have 2 more hours of work before I can sleep, and I don't take orders from men who can barely walk." His face, usually a mask of stoic control, betrayed a flash of genuine astonishment. No one, I realized, had spoken to him like that in years, maybe decades. He was used to immediate, cowering compliance. He was a man accustomed to having entire rooms fall silent when he entered them. I turned to leave, grabbing my mop and bucket. His voice, low but amused, stopped me. Boldness in a janitor, that's new. I didn't turn back. It's called self-preservation. Some people call it being a person. He let out a short, dry sound that was the first hint of genuine amusement I'd heard from him. It was a dark, unexpected sound, like stones grating together, but it eased the suffocating tension in the room. I felt a small, involuntary smile tug at the corner of my mouth. "He's dangerous," I reminded myself, "but he's also just a man with a broken leg and a lot of arrogance." I turned and shot back a retort that surprised even myself. "You don't scare me, old man." The tension completely fractured then. The smirk that spread across his face was mesmerizing. It transformed his features, softening the sharp edges and making him look startlingly handsome, almost boyish, despite the exhaustion under his eyes. It wasn't a kind smile, but it was genuine. It melted the ice between us, just for a moment, and I could feel the shift, a palpable loosening of the air. That night, after I'd checked his dressing, the conversation took another unexpected turn toward the personal. The silence felt heavy, but this time it wasn't hostile. "What do you read, Arya?" he asked, using my name in a way that sounded less like a reluctant acknowledgement and more like a careful taste of a forbidden word. "Anything I can find," I admitted. "Right now, I have a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo." He raised an eyebrow, a clear sign of surprise. "A story of betrayal and revenge. Fitting." "It's also a story of endurance and the search for justice," I corrected him. I found the page and started reading aloud. The sound of my voice soft and steady in the echoing heat of the boiler room. I read about Dante's imprisonment, his loss, his slow, careful planning. I got to the passage where the main character, having suffered unimaginable wrong, finds the resolve to continue. I read the words, letting the emotions sink in. Even the darkest men can find light again. They just have to look beyond their own shadows. I lowered the book, my gaze lifting to meet his. Dante was looking at the ceiling, his jaw tight. He didn't meet my eyes, but I saw the muscles in his neck tense. He whispered the words into the dusty air, low and rough, as if arguing with a phantom from his past. "Not all men." I shut the book gently. That single phrase, those 3 simple words, said more than all his demands and his silence combined. It was a confession of profound, unshakable self-loathing. It told me his past was not just criminal, it was heavy. I realized with a sudden sinking feeling in my stomach that I wasn't just hiding a wounded man, I was witnessing the slow, agonizing surrender of a soul, and a tiny, reckless part of me wanted to be the one to prove him wrong. The fragile peace we had constructed was violently shattered 3 days later. I'd come in earlier than usual, worried about a fever that had spiked the previous night. The minute I stepped into the boiler room, I saw it. Tucked carelessly under his pillow, glinting in the faint light filtering from a grate, was a gun, a sleek, black, heavy automatic weapon. My heart didn't just pound, it dropped entirely, landing cold and hard in my stomach. The sight of the weapon was a physical blow, a harsh reminder that everything gentle and shared between us was a lie. He wasn't just a tough guy who'd been mugged, he was a killer. Or, at the very least, a soldier in a war that had nothing to do with me. I picked it up. It was cold, heavy, and sickeningly real. I leveled it, not at him, but I held it tight enough that my knuckles were white. He didn't move. He just looked at me, his eyes finally revealing the dangerous, predatory nature I had successfully ignored until now. There was no apology, no pretense, just a chilling calm. "Give me the gun, Arya," he commanded, his voice dead level. "Who are you, really?" I demanded, the question bursting out of me, raw and desperate. I finally understood the sirens, the silence, the sheer volume of his fear. That wasn't a mugging. This isn't self-defense. That is a hitman's weapon. Tell me who you are. His silence stretched, a palpable barrier between us. He hesitated, searching my face, perhaps trying to decide if he should lie, or threaten, or simply kill the innocent witness. Finally, he spoke. The words weighted with the burden of his life. "Someone who's done things I can't undo, Arya. Things that would make you hate me." I felt the shock, a physical jolt, but oddly, I didn't run. I couldn't. Curiosity, or maybe a strange form of protective delusion, kept me planted there. I recognized the name now. The local news had been buzzing for weeks about the disappearance of the city's Shadow King, the man who quietly controlled the docks, the nightlife, and everything that moved in the dark corners. Dante Bellini, the Wolf. The man every cop in Naples and the FBI wanted. The man I was hiding. He saw the recognition in my eyes. He saw the shift from confusion to terror, and then to a strange, steely resolve. I said, my voice shaking but holding steady, "Then maybe this time, you undo something. You start by telling me the truth." And for the first time since I dragged him into the boiler room, Dante lowered his head. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was a profound gesture of surrender, of being truly, utterly humbled. "My truth," he admitted, his voice barely a rasp, "is written in blood, the blood of men like me, and sometimes the blood of the innocent." The air thickened with the implication. The man who ordered lives to be ended was begging for his own to be saved. He was admitting his monstrous nature, not with pride, but with a profound, bitter resignation. I knew I should run, call the police, scream for help. He was a mafia boss, a killer, a criminal of the highest order. But all I could see was the broken man who listened to me read the Count of Monte Cristo, the man whose eyes held a flicker of guilt when I mentioned my brother Marco. I didn't give him the gun back immediately. I held on to it for a long, terrifying moment, then placed it carefully on the metal drum, just out of his reach. I didn't say, "I forgive you." I didn't say, "I understand." I just stood there, letting the magnitude of the revelation settle around us. I had just found the truth, a truth darker and more dangerous than I could have imagined. And the terrifying thing was, knowing he was a monster hadn't made me leave. It had only made me want to understand the man behind the monster. If you think secrets can destroy even the strongest hearts, if you believe that a dangerous truth is worth uncovering, subscribe right now. Only dreamers believe love can survive the truth. Click that button because the story is about to get very, very real. The revelation of Dante's true identity, Dante Bellini, the mafia boss, didn't make me run, but it did change everything. The air in the boiler room, already thick with heat and secrets, now felt charged with a terrifying electricity. I still brought him food, still cleaned his wounds, but every touch became electric. Every shared glance held the weight of 1,000 unspoken consequences. Our bond grew stronger, strangely, because the biggest lie between us was finally gone. The lines blurred constantly between danger and genuine tenderness. He was still a ruthless man of power, but now, when he looked at me, I saw a person struggling to wear a mask that had been ripped off. I started helping him walk. His leg was mending, but the atrophy was severe. Twice a day, away from the shift changes and the possibility of detection, I'd help him stand. It was a slow, painful process. He was too proud to lean on me fully, but the moment I placed my hand on his shoulder, guiding him, supporting his weight, he would relax just enough. Those moments were deeply intimate. My body pressed against his strong, tense frame, my breath catching every time my fingers brushed the skin of his neck. He never flinched from the physical closeness, yet his eyes would be focused on the worn concrete floor, as if looking anywhere but at me. We were two broken people learning to rely on each other. It was during these slow, shuffling walks that the real man, the one buried deep beneath the ruthless reputation, started to emerge. He began to talk, not about his operations or his enemies, but about the ghost he feared becoming. One evening, leaning heavily on me as we circled the old machinery, he spoke in a low, gravelly voice, haunted by memory. He talked about his mother, how she used to make him read poetry, how she taught him that even in their world, honor was the only thing you truly owned. He confessed his regrets, the things he'd done that he couldn't take back, the path he had chosen that had ultimately alienated him from the man his mother had wanted him to be. "I was born to this life, Arya," he admitted, resting his head briefly against mine. The vulnerability of the gesture stole my breath. I didn't have to become this. I let the power hollow me out. Now I'm just a story I can't change. He feared becoming a ghost, a legend that was all name and no soul. I listened, absorbing his pain, realizing that the monster everyone feared was terrified of his own reflection. He wasn't trying to excuse his sins, he was simply laying them down. "You're not a ghost yet, Dante," I whispered, gripping his hand tighter. It was a powerful hand, capable of ruin, but in my small grip, it felt suddenly human, needy. One night, the fear must have become too much for him. I found him struggling to dress, attempting to put on the ruined, blood-stained clothes I had hidden away. He was going to leave. "Stop," I said, walking to the doorway and blocking the exit. He straightened up, his eyes burning with the old, cold authority. "Don't be foolish, Arya. I can't stay here. My people will be searching, and if they find you with me—" "You still can't walk alone," I cut him off. The words hung between us, heavy and layered. It was a statement of his physical state, yes, but it meant so much more. It meant, you can't go back to that life alone. You can't face this reckoning alone. And maybe I don't want you to. He stared at me, his breath harsh. The defiance, the danger, and the raw need in the air became too much. He took a staggering step toward me, and then another, until his body was flush against mine. His hands, which had only known violence and control, settled gently on my waist. I didn't pull away. I leaned in, surrendering to the inevitable gravity that had been pulling us together since the moment my mop hit the floor. He lowered his head, his lips meeting mine in a kiss that was desperate, demanding, and utterly heartbreaking. It wasn't the sweet, tentative kiss of a first date. It was the raw, primal expression of two lost souls finding a single anchor in the storm. It tasted of regret and reckless fire. In that moment, the janitor and the mafia boss were gone, and there were only two people clinging to a dangerous, forbidden connection. The fire of his world had met the rain of mine, and the world, my world, was changed forever. If you believe even a broken, powerful man can find light and tenderness again, if you believe that true connection transcends background, like this video right now. Only the heartless scroll past redemption in a love story that started with blood. The brief, intense warmth of our shared kiss only underscored the cold reality of our situation. We were living on borrowed time. Our moment of tenderness was rudely interrupted the next morning. I was finishing my shift. Dante was lying down, pretending to sleep, and the building was silent. That silence was shattered not by a sound, but by a chilling, subtle change in the light. I looked up through the basement grate that opened onto the back alley. A car. A black Mercedes S-Class, the kind of car that announced serious money and even more serious intent. It was too clean, too heavy, too out of place. My blood ran cold, but Dante's reaction was terrifyingly swift. He scrambled off his mat, ignoring the searing pain in his mended leg. "The car," he hissed, his eyes suddenly hard, totally focused. "I know that car. They found me."
His enemies hadn't just found him, they had tracked him to my refuge, and they hadn't come alone. As I peered through the small opening, I saw two dark, bulky figures emerge from the car, their movements fluid and practiced. They were professionals. The air exploded into chaos. Before I could process the image, the steel door to the boiler room groaned under a massive, synchronized assault. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was deafening, metallic, and final. Dante didn't hesitate. He snatched the gun I had placed away from him, the very weapon that had exposed his identity, and shoved me violently behind a stack of old metal filing cabinets. "Stay behind me! Don't move," he barked, the tenderness of the night before completely erased, replaced by the instinct of a man fighting for survival. The door flew off its hinges with a sickening crack. The next sequence was a blur of noise and adrenaline. Gunfire erupted, deafening in the small, enclosed space. Bullets whizzed past, chewing into the concrete and shattering the dusty bulbs. I screamed, the sound lost in the explosion of violence. Dante was a machine. Even with his limp, he moved with deadly precision, returning fire. He was a force of nature, protecting me with a terrifying primal fury. But he was outnumbered and exposed. He shielded me with his entire body, pressing himself against the cabinets in front of me as the bullets hammered into our makeshift sanctuary. I could feel the impact of the shots hitting the metal inches from my head. Then, a sickening, dull thud. Dante let out a sharp, choked gasp, and his weight suddenly became unbearable. He collapsed, not falling away, but sinking directly into my arms. I felt the wet, sticky warmth of new blood spreading quickly across the back of his shirt. My adrenaline spiked, burning away the fear. All I could see was the man who had whispered his regrets, the man whose kiss had stolen my breath. The gunmen, perhaps thinking their target was down, momentarily ceased fire. The silence that followed was far worse than the noise. I wrapped my arms around Dante, holding his heavy, bleeding form against me. His breathing was shallow and ragged, and his eyes, wide with shock, were fixed on my face. "Don't you dare die on me!" I screamed. The heartbreak and sheer terror rolled into one gut-wrenching cry. It was heartbreak, violence, and adrenaline rolled into one
devastating moment. The mafia boss, the man who never bent, had taken a bullet for the janitor. He had collapsed, undone and bleeding in the arms of the one person who had dared to see past the blood on his hands. And as the pain finally overwhelmed him, his fierce dark eyes fluttered shut. My world tilted and descended into a terrifying, unknown darkness. The ride to the hospital was a screaming nightmare of flashing blue lights and the metallic smell of blood. I clung to Dante in the back of the ambulance, whispering desperate promises and pressing the gauze to his new wound, terrified that the warmth was fading too fast. The police had arrived at the scene, drawn by the frantic 911 call I'd finally made, and they treated me as a witness, perhaps even a victim. But they already knew who Dante was. His identity was too notorious to hide once he was found, bleeding in a pool of spent casings. At the hospital, everything began to unravel with terrifying speed. Doctors whisked Dante away, and I was immediately cornered by detectives. I stuck to my story. I was the night janitor, I heard the shots, I found him, and I called for help. I left out the basement, the soup, the whispered regrets, and the forbidden kiss. But the police weren't asking about what happened tonight. They were asking about who Dante Bellini was. As the interrogation wore on, the name they kept repeating, Dante's full criminal name, started to connect with files they pulled up on their tablets. And then, a detective showed me a different kind of file, a cold case, a closed incident from 3 years ago. Aria D'Souza, the detective said, his voice flat and professional. You lost a family member 3 years ago, your brother, Marco D'Souza. My breath hitched. Marco. The memory was always close, a raw ache. Yes, I managed to whisper. He was killed. Hit and run, they called it. A failed robbery that went wrong. The detective slid a photo across the table. It wasn't Dante, but a man I recognized, one of Dante's known enforcers, a vicious lieutenant who had been captured only months ago. The file detailed the confession. Marco's death hadn't been a random robbery. It had been a botched intimidation tactic, a chaotic message sent to a rival business owner. The violence was meant to be small, but it spiraled into death. And the order to greenlight the intimidation had come from the top. It had come from Dante Bellini. The scene slowed to an agonizing crawl. My breathing shook, rattling in my chest. The world, which had just been a desperate rush of adrenaline, turned icy cold and impossibly still. The man I had risked my life for, the man whose vulnerability I had fallen for, the man I had just held, bleeding in my arms and kissed with desperate hope, he was responsible for my brother's death. Indirectly, perhaps, but his power, his world, had crushed the only family I had left. When they finally allowed me a few brief minutes by Dante's bedside in the ICU, the air was thick with IV drips and the steady beep, beep, beep of the monitoring machines. He looked small, pale, and utterly defeated. I walked to his side, and the moment he saw my eyes, he knew. He knew I had discovered the full, unvarnished truth. The police hadn't told him, but the look of absolute, shattering betrayal on my face was enough. He tried to sit up, his hand reaching for mine, his expression a desperate plea. Aria, I swear, I didn't know it was him. It wasn't an order to kill. It was... I pulled my hand back as if his touch was toxic fire. The tears finally came, not of sadness, but of pure, incandescent rage and grief. You killed the only family I had, I whispered, the words catching in my throat, each one a shard of glass. Your orders, your power, your life, it took him from me. And I saved you. I loved you. I saw him break. Not just the physical break of the wounds, but the total, crushing collapse of the man I had seen humbled in the boiler room. The mafia boss, the unfeeling tyrant, finally shattered. Tears, real, heavy, uncontrollable tears tracked paths through the bloodstain on his temple. It was the first time I or anyone had ever seen Dante Bellini truly weep. He couldn't speak. He just lay there, undone by the magnitude of his sin and the painful justice of the moment. He had sought mercy, and now the source of that mercy had been revealed to be the very person his cruel, detached life had wounded most deeply. If you think love should never, ever come from pain, if you think Dante deserves the suffering he's feeling right now, hit subscribe. We are at the point of no return. Only the cruel think wounds make people weak, but they often make us stronger. The next few weeks were a confusing, agonizing vacuum. The hospital was under heavy guard, Dante recovering but effectively imprisoned by the police investigation and the watchful eyes of his surviving rivals. I was banned from visiting, cited as a material witness whose testimony was now too emotionally compromised. I'd tried to go back to my life, to the comforting routine of the mop and bucket, but everything felt tainted, hollowed out by the betrayal. The memory of the intimacy in the boiler room now felt like a cruel joke. I was certain it was over. He was a killer, and I was the sister of his victim. There was no going back. Then, one rainy Tuesday night, I found it. It wasn't in the office building, but tucked into the rusty mailbox of my cramped, small apartment, a place he should have never known. A single, pristine white rose, and underneath it, an envelope. My heart hammered, a mix of terror and a terrifying, unwelcome hope. I took the letter inside, my hands shaking so violently I could barely tear the paper open. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a defense. It was a long, painstaking confession. He detailed everything. He wrote about the pressure that had made him ruthless, the decisions that had become so detached from morality that he hadn't even tracked the minor operations. He confessed every lie he told himself, every sin he committed, every person he allowed to be hurt by his greed and his pride. He wrote about Marco, the specific date of the incident, and the way the news had crossed his desk. A single, insignificant line item dismissed as collateral damage. He wrote that his guilt, the guilt I had seen flicker in his eyes the first night I mentioned the folk song, had been real. He knew his world was capable of that specific cruelty, and he had been too afraid to ask the specific details of my brother's death, fearing the answer would be exactly what it turned out to be.
The ink was smudged in places, as if written quickly, or perhaps with a tear. At the end, there was no apology that felt adequate, just a single, devastating promise written in his distinctive, strong script. You showed me mercy, Area, when I was nothing but blood and fear. I did not deserve it then, and I do not deserve your forgiveness now, but I will spend the rest of my life earning it, even if you never look at me again. The music swelled in my memory, the soft piano, the distant sound of rain that always seemed to accompany our destiny. I stood in my tiny living room, the confession clutched to my chest, and I began to weep again. But this time, the tears weren't just rage and grief. They were complicated. They were the painful acknowledgement of a soul that had finally, truly surrendered. I looked at the promise, I will spend the rest of my life earning it, and a small, fragile smile touched my lips, cutting through the devastation. He wasn't promising to run away or to silence his enemies. He was promising to change. I whispered the words to the empty room, the final, painful realization of our saga. You finally learned to walk, Dante. The next few months were dominated by Dante's seismic shift. I didn't see him, but his presence was unavoidable. It was splashed across every front page, every news ticker. The man who had once ruled the shadows of the city was now dragging them into the light. He didn't run. He didn't use his network of lawyers and influence to manipulate the justice system. Instead, he made good on his promise. He began systematically shutting down his empire. It wasn't a quiet retreat. It was an active dismantling. He turned himself into the authorities, and in a series of shocking, high-stakes testimonies, he gave the police everything they needed to arrest his former men, his brutal lieutenants, and his corrupted financial allies.
His old allies cursed him, their faces snarling with disbelief and rage on the television screen. They called him a traitor, a fool, a man who had lost his mind for a moment of weakness. But Dante, when reporters managed to catch a glimpse of him being escorted in and out of courtrooms, looked entirely different from the man I'd first found bleeding in the rain. He looked tired, yes, but there was a peace in his posture that had never existed before. He was finally walking under his own weight, shedding the burden of his life. I watched the news coverage from the quiet safety of my tiny apartment. My eyes were full of disbelief and a quiet, complicated pride. He wasn't just accepting punishment. He was enacting justice against the very system he had built. He was taking responsibility for the ripple effect of his violence. The final act of his surrender, the one that truly broke me and allowed the forgiveness I desperately needed, came a week later. I received a letter from a respected, independent foundation dedicated to victims of urban violence. Dante, before surrendering completely, had systematically liquidated his entire offshore wealth and donated it, an astronomical sum, in the name of Marco de Souza. The money was meaningless to me, but the gesture was everything. It wasn't about clearing his name. It was about honoring the life he had indirectly taken. It was the only possible way for him to pay the debt. He wasn't just apologizing. He was attempting to repair the world he had broken. That evening, I finally felt the sharp, jagged edges of my grief soften. I forgave him. Not because he deserved the relief of my forgiveness, he would carry his guilt forever, but because I deserved peace. I deserved to let go of the consuming rage and the agonizing confusion he had inflicted. Dante had taught me that even the darkest men can choose light, and in doing so, he allowed me to step back into the light myself. The mafia boss had finally walked away from his power. Months turned into a year. The memory of the boiler room had begun to fade into a strange, intense dream. Dante was serving his time, a sentence reduced significantly due to his comprehensive cooperation and testimony, but a severe sentence nonetheless. He was locked away, but he was finally free from the prison of his own darkness. My life had found its rhythm again. I had taken a new job, cleaning at a different facility, a large, modern rehabilitation hospital far across the city. It was cleaner, brighter, and the people were kinder. One afternoon, as I was pushing my cleaning cart down a newly sanitized corridor, a nurse stopped me. She smiled gently and handed me a simple, white envelope. "A gentleman asked me to give this to you," she said, her voice warm. "He was just visiting a patient." My hands trembled as I took the envelope. I recognized the subtle, musky scent of paper, the same expensive, thick stationery from the confession letter. Inside, there was no long text. Only two things: a single, perfect white rose, carefully preserved, and a small note, written in that familiar, strong script. "You cleaned more than blood. You cleaned my soul. L." The silent initial for Luca, the name he had given me in the hospital, the name I had kept secret from the world, a final, private communication between the janitor and the man she saved. My heart filled with a profound, quiet emotion. It wasn't the frantic passion of the boiler room, but something deeper, more lasting. It was love based not on proximity, but on transformation. I walked to the nearest window, pushing the blinds aside. It was a bright, crisp day outside. I looked down, searching the busy grounds below, and then I saw him. Sitting under a large, leafy oak tree, bathed in the afternoon sunlight, was a man in a simple gray jacket. He was seated in a wheelchair, his once commanding body now constrained. He wasn't looking up, he was simply watching the world pass by, patiently. As I watched, he looked up as if sensing my presence, and his eyes met mine across the distance. He didn't move. He simply smiled. It was a small, genuine, and utterly transformed smile. The same hint of warmth I had first seen in the boiler room, now stripped of all arrogance and pain. It was the smile of a man who had paid his debt and was finally learning to live, humbly, in the light. He had learned to walk, after all, just not on his own 2 feet. I held the rose tight against my heart, the tears blurring my vision. He was alive, he was free, and he was working to be better. It wasn't the fairy tale ending of the movies. It was something truer. It was a promise of a future, distant and complicated, built on truth, atonement, and the kind of fierce, earned love that comes from saving a monster and seeing the man he could be.